as very few of you know, because our assembly was sort of swallowed up as a part of our Congress last year, in a small meeting in the middle of a much bigger meeting, I became the Forward in Faith president. It was certainly an honor to be able to step into this position, but I assure you that, as I said, when I succeeded a rector who had been in our parish for 24 years and then left through death rather than through retirement, I couldn't replace him. I can only help try to fulfill the function that he did. And I'm certainly not replacing Bishop Ackerman, but I'm trying to fulfill the responsibilities that he undertook as president. So anyway, thank you for your... At any rate, I'd like to talk about this first year as being your president and where we are now in the context of the Congress. The Congress was a labor to which Forward in Faith committed itself early on, many years before it actually took place, because what happened after 2006, in the years, the next decade leading up to now, as you know, there was a great jurisdictional shift regarding faithful Orthodox Anglicans in North America. There had been certainly some changes going on for the previous 30 years, or 40 years, but there became even more after 2006. And so what we've recognized in all of the things that have happened, which we don't need to rehearse nationally and internationally, is that Forward in Faith in some ways was being challenged to see itself more in the context of our preceding organization that led to ESA and Forward in Faith, namely the Evangelical and Catholic Mission. In those days, we saw ourselves not as primarily trying to deal with jurisdictions, but rather to make a witness for the fullness of our evangelical and Catholic faith. And so we were primarily a teaching and a witnessing organization. Well, given the jurisdictional changes, we recognized that we now could be a part of the means by which Anglicanism in its fullness, meaning our full Catholic faith and order, as well as all the other things that are in our prayer that's on your table, and I please hope you'll take some of these with you and be praying for Forward in Faith. We wanted to call a Catholic Congress for Anglicans internationally, and that's what we were able to do last year. And you would, if you looked at the list of speakers who spoke last year, you found that they were all over the map jurisdictionally, including non-Anglicans, because our mission is really larger than Anglicanism. It has to do with the fullness of and the unity of the body of Christ. And our little part as Anglicans needs to bear that in mind. We heard in an address by our keynote speaker a few years ago, who gave us all three addresses, and he did all of those with no notes, but it was incredible, Bishop Michael Nazarali. He reminded us that Anglicanism itself is provisional. That is to say, it's not, we're not going to have a special segment in heaven for Anglicans. It's meant to serve the glory of God and the upbuilding of His kingdom, and it came into existence for a purpose, and it may well fade out of existence for a purpose, and that purpose is the unity of the body of Christ. And so we were more than happy to invite Antiochian Orthodox speakers as well as others from across boundaries. Next year's keynote speaker for our assembly is Roman Catholic. We're not committed to any one denomination even as our goal. It's rather the full witness. So that leads me to want to say this about the membership of Forward in Faith. Michael Howell, our executive director, when he gives his report, is going to give you some statistics. But let me just ask you for a show of hands. How many of you here this evening are in the Episcopal Church? Okay. And how many of you are in some diocese within the ACNA? And how many of you are in a group affiliated with FACA? Okay. And how many of you are in none of the above? Okay. So there you have it. That's who we are. That's Forward in Faith. We are not looking for a solution that is jurisdictional, but we trust that God will use us, and my conviction certainly is that God will use whatever we offer to His glory that's done in faith and obedience. He will use it wherever it needs to be used. A role or an example of how I see God working in this way, you know, we're always allowed, thanks to the Seventh Ecumenical Council, we are allowed to picture God in various ways, doing various things. And so I've taken the liberty of doing so by imagining Him as the fictional character played by Lily Tomlin, known as Ernestine, the telephone operator. God, I think, is a bit like a telephone operator. He receives what we offer, and He plugs it in wherever it needs to go. And we don't have to know what that is. But if we're offering it faithfully and lovingly, He knows where it needs to be. And in His economy, He makes sure that nothing is lost. And so this is part of the great privilege we have of not having to worry about where it's all going to go. We just plow the little row that's in front of us that He's given us and trust that He will make use of it in whatever way He can. And if we take that seriously, it delivers us from the burden of having to know the result of everything we're doing. Bishop Ackerman, years ago and early on in his presidency, reminded us of an addiction that Americans have, thinking that we need to know, and we think we have the right to know how everything turns out. You know, as if we paid our $10 to get into the movie, we get to see the end. But he reminded us that no, that's up to God. And if Jesus Himself said He didn't know when the end was going to be, then who are we to think we should? So we don't get to know how it all turns out in the short run. But that's okay, because we know how it all turns out in the long run. So that's really part of where we are. What I hope that we will be doing here and through all the ministries of Forward in Faith is to continue to work for the spreading of God's kingdom. And as I alluded in the homily, to me, this Christian enterprise all centers on relationships. Peter Kraft, in one of his great books, reminded us that we're only going to be doing two things in heaven for which we have any guarantee scripturally. And those two things are going to have three objects. I might take exception with him as to the number three. I think there may be more than that, but allowing him the greater weight for what he said. The two things we're going to be doing in heaven are knowing and loving. And that's because those two activities are by nature eternal. How many of you have been married, let's say, more than 40 years? Do you know everything about your spouse? No. And how many of you could say, how many of you are widowed? Okay. Could you possibly say, when your wife died or when your husband died, that you were done loving them? No. Love requires eternity, and knowledge requires eternity. And so knowing and loving is what we're going to be doing. And Kraft says that the objects of our knowing and loving will be God, first of all, others, everyone else, and ourselves. When He reveals to us our name, which is written on stone, and that's revealed to us as we read in Revelation, we'll know ourselves as He knows us, and we'll get to know others. And because relationships are never finished, that project is eternal. And so knowing and loving, and it's all relational. And that's why the summary of the law, and that's why the introduction to the blessing, the knowledge and love of God and of His Son, Jesus Christ. So all of that focuses on what we do. So we're going to be centering our lives in Forward in Faith on trying to assist and encourage and challenge us to continue to grow in those two practices and those three objects at the very least. And I know that we have so many people who can help us to do that. I said it's everything from our own nourishment, but we're only nourished so that we can then share that with others. to how we share that with others, part of what Father Culpepper is going to be addressing to our benefit and challenge. And that's really what I'm envisioning for the next 2 years of my presidency, at least in Forward in Faith, is that we will be able to tie everything in those respects so that we are honoring God and not losing any sleep over what's going to happen to the Anglican Communion, what's going to happen to ultimate reunion. You know, Pope John Paul II, when he became the pontiff, his goal, his primary goal, and some of you might remember this, was the reunion of Orthodoxy and Rome. And he didn't get to live to see that happen. But I don't think it mattered to him that he didn't get to see it happen because he knew he was working towards it. Our goal is a somewhat similar one, and if we can all sort of live comfortably with knowing that's what we are about and at the same time accept the challenge to get at it more vigorously, more intentionally, and it can start with how we treat one another this week, then I think that Forward in Faith will continue to be fulfilling its mandate and being useful in the spread of the kingdom. So, thank you. Thank you.